I am really excited to be speaking to the R.I.O.T Science Club about how you can use Twitter for science, and I'm going to be going over why you should be using it if you aren't already, and some practical steps on how. So let's jump into it. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a parable that was told in the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to start with a bit of theology today. And this is the parable of the talents. And one key takeaway from this parable is that Jesus said, for all those that have more will be given, which is a kind of a reflection of how things are in life. It was a reflection of how things were 2,000 years ago. And it's a reflection of how things are in society right now. And you'd think that that science would be a meritocracy in the sense that obviously we want things to be fair, but when it comes to science, the people who are in charge, it's to their best interests to make sure that things aren't fair. So right now, we have a situation where science is not a meritocracy, and the people at the top, the people who already have a lot of stuff, are going to get more. And when it comes to getting more, I'm talking about invitations for papers, opportunities for publishing papers, opportunities for speaking, and opportunities to speak about your research in the media. So this is called the Matthew effect, and it's a huge issue within academia. Now, right now, there are 4 ways to get your research known, but only one of these ways is open to every early career researcher. The first way is to already be famous, and if that's the case, lucky you. The second one is to have a famous mentor. A lot of people are very fortunate to be in labs with very famous mentors that can bring their mentees up. But again, that isn't something that's open to other people. The other way is to repeatedly win the peer review lottery, or to repeatedly win the grant review lottery. As much as we would love to think that peer review is fair and that grant review is fair, sometimes that's just not the case. It's not a meritocracy. The best papers, the best quality papers, sometimes don't get through peer review, or they have a lot of trouble getting through peer review. Now, the final way that you can actually get your work known is to actively contribute to social media. And the great thing about this is that this is something which is open to everybody. Not everyone's famous. Not everyone has a famous mentor. Not everyone has the opportunity to win the peer review lottery. And the unfortunate thing is, for a lot of early career researchers, you are one bad decision or one unlucky decision away from having to actually leave academia. And that, quite frankly, is not fair. But when it comes to social media, what it does is it levels the playing field, and it gives early career researchers, or it gives any researcher, the opportunity to talk about their work. And the main reason being is this idea of gatekeeping. Now, right now, the traditional media, I'm talking about newspapers, radio stations, television stations, they decide whether they want to share your research and how this is done as well. Quite often, you'll send a press release, it'll get sent, and you'll be told, yes, this is going to be posted on this date, only to find another news story bumps your story out, and your story isn't told. Or it's told in a way which misrepresents your research. We've heard so many stories about researchers who look at their work, look at how the press release looks, and realizes that it's really different from how their research actually should be represented. So there's not much control there, but most importantly, there's not much control in how your work is shared. If you already have a regular column in a newspaper, that's great. If you already have a relationship with journalists, that's great. But there are lots of gatekeepers there which can potentially limit your ability to talk about your research to the wider community. The second issue is, which I touched on before, is that scientific journals limit what is published and how quickly. It's up to the editors, and it's up to the peer reviewers to actually look at your work, and it can take years to actually get your work from the idea, from getting past institutional review boards, from collecting data, up until the fact that it's actually published in the first place. There's a lot of gatekeepers there when it gets to getting your research out. And finally, when it comes to conferences, conference organisers decide who actually comes and gets to speak. And I think it's a little bit different now that a lot of conferences and seminars like this are done online. But pre-coronavirus, there was a situation where you'd happen to see the same speakers at every single conference. And the reason being is that the conference organisers are the same ones going to the other conferences, and they only go with what's familiar. So you get the same sort of faces going and speaking at these conferences, not giving opportunities to early career researchers or to other researchers that typically don't get a chance because they're not already famous, they're not part of the famous institution, or they don't have the famous mentor. So you have to get past these gatekeepers of actually getting your work out there. So we have these three different areas. You have when it comes to sharing your work to the media, when it comes to the primary way of getting our research out there, which is through journals, but it's also through conferences. And that's one of the main ways in a lot of fields to get yourself and to get your research known. Now, the traditional publication system, we all know how it is. You submit your paper, it goes to the editor. If you're lucky, your editor will send it out for review, or it might get desk rejected, or if you're very unlucky, it might sit on the editor's desk for weeks, and in some cases, months. And then it gets sent out, if you're lucky, it gets sent out to the reviewers, and there is at least a 3-month minimum, if you're very lucky, to get some feedback on your work. It might be revise and resubmit. And we know this whole process can take months and months and months until it finally gets accepted. And then when it gets accepted, then at that stage can the public and can other scientists actually see your work. And this is the traditional system, the traditional way of doing things, the way we've been doing things since the 19th century when peer-reviewed journals first, or the 18th century when peer-reviewed journals first emerged. But now, with social media, and particularly with Twitter, we can get instant access, or we can give instant access to our work to get, firstly, to share our work, but secondly, to get almost instant feedback on our research from other scientists. We don't have to wait months and months and months to actually get our research out there. And a big benefit of that is a lot of people are worried about what if someone is going to scoop my work? What if someone is going to scoop my research? But with preprints, as soon as you're done, as soon as you're finished with your work, of course you can go through the peer review route. I'm not saying that peer review is bad. I'm just saying it takes a long time, and sometimes it can be biased, and sometimes it can be unfair. But with preprints and with social media, as a way to actually promote and to share your preprint, there is a way to share your work immediately, which completely upends the traditional publication system in which it can take months or years to get your research out there. So Twitter, social media, but especially Twitter, gets around these gatekeepers so you can share your ideas and research immediately. And it's an absolute game changer for actually making making academia, which at the present is not a level playing field, a little bit more level for people who don't have the same sort of opportunities. Now, right now, a lot of people say to me, well, Twitter's a fad. It's not going to be around in a few years. And that might be the case. We all know how it is with MySpace. I'm old enough to have had a MySpace account, and Twitter might not be around in the future, but it doesn't matter. When it comes to social media and when it comes to sharing information, essentially there are three main mediums that we're going to be sharing information: audio, text, and images. The platform might change. I have no particular romance right now towards Twitter, but the reason that I talk a lot about Twitter is because that is where people's attention is at the moment. So that's why I think it's important. This could change in the future, or it could remain. I've been on Twitter for 10 years now, so that shows you how long Twitter has been around. So it's sticking around, but we don't know how long it's going to stick around. But it doesn't matter, in that regardless of what platform is going to be primarily used in the future, there's always going to be an opportunity, there's always going to be a need to be good or to understand how to share your research online via primarily a text-based medium, which is what Twitter is. And of course, there's alternatives like Facebook. The reason I don't talk too much about Facebook is that Facebook right now is oversaturated. There are too many eyes. There's a big need to actually have advertising to make sure that your research and your work is seen. Because there's basically too much content and not enough people reading it. And because there's too many people out there and so much content out there, you need to actually pay to get your work up to the top. Whereas Twitter is a bit more even. There's enough eyes and there's enough eyeballs and enough people actually producing stuff that you don't necessarily need advertising to actually get your work out there. So although I think it's important to have some sort of presence on Facebook at a bare minimum, because that's where a lot of people are, it's very difficult to do science communication on Facebook unless you have a very image-based sort of work. like all those pictures of galaxies, people love them. But unless your work is very, very image-based, it's very difficult to actually communicate your research on Facebook, whereas Twitter, it is much, much easier. So that's why I focus on that. But of course, there's also blogging, which is a really useful way of doing a more long-form discussion. Of course, you can do threads and you can write a lot on Twitter, but if you're doing a well-considered long-form article, then blogs are the way to go. And of course, you would post a link to a blog on your Twitter account. And of course, there are more image-based social media services as well. There's a few people doing some great stuff on Instagram when it comes to science, and TikTok is emerging as a humongously popular platform, especially with younger people. So if you want to get your work out there, and if you want to target younger people, TikTok is absolutely the platform that you need to be. It's just the growth is huge, and it's a lot of fun. So I'd recommend checking it out. And of course, there's also audio with primarily through podcasts, and podcasts are great because you can listen to them or you can take them in passively. You can be going out for a walk, or you can be commuting. Well, people aren't really commuting as much nowadays, but podcasts are a fantastic way to get your research out there. And I think they're actually, in a sense, a little bit easier than blogging. Personally, I actually prefer podcasting to blogging because it takes a lot less time. With blogging, you have to sit down, you have to write, but with podcasts, you're just talking, and they're a lot of fun as well. So we have these three main modalities in which we're communicating research: audio, text, and images. Although the platforms might change, the medium won't. And right now, when it comes to text, that's where Twitter is where people are paying the most attention. Now, a common thing that I hear when I talk to people or talk to different audiences is, well, Twitter isn't very popular in my field. No one in my institute uses Twitter, so why should I even bother? But I think it's important to highlight that, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of gatekeeping, and it basically forms a cycle in that only the people that already have opportunities can continue to get more opportunities. But if only a small percentage of people, or if only a small percentage of the decision makers are on Twitter and seeing your work, then that actually increases your chance of getting within that cycle, or getting within that cycle of attention. So it doesn't matter if a lot of people aren't using it. And if that's the case, lucky you, because you can be one of the first people that are actually posting a lot of stuff. And when more and more people join Twitter, which is happening more and more, because a lot of institutions are encouraging their academics and are encouraging their students and encouraging their staff to join Twitter, you'll be the one that's actually been on there for a few years. So it's actually an advantage if not a lot of people within your field are on Twitter. So don't let that discourage you. Now, to give you an example of how I've used Twitter in the past with my work, as mentioned before, my research primarily looks at the hormone oxytocin, which you may have heard of as the love hormone or the cuddle chemical or some other name to that effect. And that's how it's known in a popular sense. That isn't entirely true. And a lot of my work in an academic sense has actually been questioning that idea that it's a cuddle chemical, but also questioning the idea that oxytocin is exclusively a social chemical at all. And that's where a lot of my work has been going, and that's been great. The articles have gotten quite a few reads, and it's gotten a little bit of attention. But the thing is, this idea that oxytocin is a love hormone is constraining research, and that's why I've been looking at this idea that no, it's actually a little bit more broader than that. So I've written these papers, and that's been fine. But what's actually gotten the most attention is stuff that I've written on Twitter. Last year, or last Valentine's Day, I wrote a thread which was explaining, because if you search the word oxytocin on Valentine's Day, it's huge. People are talking about oxytocin. I'm gonna hug my partner for 7 seconds. It's always 7 seconds for some strange reason. I'm gonna hug my partner for 7 seconds and increase oxytocin, which is all fine. You should be hugging your partner. But people are talking about it. But I decided to write a thread actually explaining what oxytocin actually does. And when you actually compare the sort of attention that my research gets, or my academic papers get, the sort of attention that a Twitter thread can get, or a tweet can get, is absolutely huge. This particular thread, which is a collection of collected tweets, has been seen over 70,000 times, which is I can never dream to get anything close to that with my own academic work. And this is shared both by scientists and also by lay people as well. So you can actually target both groups of people when you're posting your stuff, or when you're posting your work on Twitter. So it's important to actually understand that even there's only so much you can actually get past, or there's only so much you can share when you're sharing your papers online, and Twitter provides fantastic opportunities to actually share your work with other people that wouldn't otherwise be reading it. And another example was last year, I did a little experiment to write what I consider to be one of the most transparent papers possible. And I put together this paper, and I live streamed the entire creation, the coding, the writing, and I tweeted about it a lot in a sense to get feedback, because this was an area that I wasn't super familiar with, but I wanted to get more familiar with. And by doing this, I was able to get some incredible feedback along the way from people from different fields, from different perspectives, because I was talking about a topic which might have different implications for different fields. And I had an idea of going, okay, I'm going to be talking about this idea, which is a synthetic data set. A synthetic data set is a data set that actually shares the same characteristics as a real data set, but the data is slightly different. So your participants can actually remain, or can actually keep their privacy, but you can still share your data so that others can reproduce your data. So others can reproduce your analysis. And this has different implications for different fields. So I shared and spoke about this a lot on Twitter and got a lot of amazing feedback from people from different fields because I was being very transparent about this paper. So you can get some amazing advice, particularly when it comes around coding and R. I've got a little bit of experience with R, but I'm not great. But by asking the questions there, you can get some great tips and great advice. So when it comes to the more practical side of things, to actually using Twitter, I quite often do talks like this, and I usually cover the why you should be on it, but I don't typically go on the how, because it's a little bit nuanced. So what I've done, or what I did, was I've actually put together a book which goes through how to do it as a scientist, going basically from the beginner stage up to the advanced stage, so that you can get tips no matter how long you've been using Twitter for. And it's free to read at t4scientist.com. But right now I'm going to be going over some basics, because I understand that there's a bit of a range of people who are watching when it comes to their experience with Twitter. But even if you're experienced, I think you can get a little bit out of these tips. Now, the first thing to consider when you sign up for your Twitter account is your Twitter profile. I think it's important to actually put in a different photo than the default, because often people associate the default photo with bots, and people don't like bots, as you would imagine. Now, you don't necessarily have to do a picture of yourself. It helps, but you don't have to do it, but just at least pick a picture so people can identify you. And then you can also use the header picture as a way to add additional information. It might be a new publication, it might be a picture of you speaking, it might be where you live or your lab. Be creative, it doesn't matter. But the most important thing is just use that actual real estate, that screen real estate, to actually share a little bit about yourself. And you want to actually describe a little bit about your research. Quite often I'll get direct messages or private messages over Twitter from people asking, how do what should I do? Can you give me some tips for Twitter? And I look at their profile and their bio is empty. So I have no idea how to actually help them, because I don't know the context of their research. Are they a PhD student? Are they a little bit more senior? What sort of work do they do? It's important to put a little bit of information about your research or about what you do in your profile as well. Also put in where you live. Sometimes it can be handy. Perhaps someone is traveling through your city and they know, that person, they live in that town. Maybe I'll give them a shout when I'm there. And also you can put in a website, whether it's a personal website, which I recommend you should get no matter what stage of your career that you're in, or an institutional website, or a link to your Google Scholar profile if you have none of those things. It's important to have that information there, because often when, say, if you're tweeting and someone retweets, quite often they'll check the profile to see, what else has this person done? And so it's important to actually have that there. Now, when it comes to composing tweets, like I mentioned before, Twitter is primarily a text-based platform, and you add your text in there, but you can also add images, up to 4 images as well. GIFs, animated pictures are fantastic. GIFs have almost taken over Twitter, and they're a lot of fun. and they add a little bit more personality to your tweets. So you can also add them there quite easily. You can add a poll. They're not exactly the most scientific things, but they can get some really interesting discussions. Maybe you want some advice. Maybe you're tossing up submitting between a few different journals, and you can put alternatives up there. Sometimes I use polls for when I'm making a graph or a plot within ggplot, and I'm not sure what colors to use or what layout to use, and I'll simply ask people, should I do plot A or should I do plot B? So these polls are quite fun. It's also very easy to add emoji for a little bit more personality. And then you can also, like I mentioned before, you can thread together and put together a series of tweets. I think in principle, you can make threads as long as you want, but in a single sitting, you can do 20 in a row. But they're a really useful way to talk about your research, and I use them whenever I publish a major paper to actually explain what the paper is. Personally, I find, and I cover this in the book if you're interested in looking more about threads, but personally, I actually think that threads, in my own experience, are actually more effective than blog posts, because threads reduce friction. If you're posting a tweet going, here's my new blog post, people actually have to click on a link and open up their web browser and read the blog post. People are lazy. I'm lazy. Sometimes I just don't do it, going, oh, well, I'll read it later. I'll save it. I'll bookmark it. But we all know the amount of bookmarks we have for papers or blog posts that we never read. But if you're writing a thread within Twitter, there's very little friction. People can actually just go through and read the research there, and see what's going on with your work, and see the images there. And it's very easy to add images, to add little videos. It's a fantastic way to share your work and to share your research. Now, a common question that I get with Twitter is, okay, I've got an account, I've filled out my bio, but what do I actually say? What do I actually share? And I think it's very simple. The best way to actually bring value on Twitter is to either educate or to entertain, because people use social media for two reasons: to either pass time or to save time. As researchers, we're all very well equipped to educate. We're very well equipped to share about our work, no matter what stage of our career that we're at. So that's something we can all do. Entertaining is a little bit trickier. Not all of us are able to do that, and that's fine. But if you can do that, lucky you. But at the very least, all of us can educate and share and talk about our work, no matter what stage of the career that we're at. So if you're doing those two things, remembering that people are using social media to either save time or pass time, that's going to make things a lot easier when it comes to sharing your work. When it comes to the primary way of how we actually use Twitter, a lot of people see it as a way of sharing their published work. Quite often, a lot of universities encourage their academics to hop onto Twitter and to post a paper. So a lot of accounts, all it is new paper, and then you don't see anything for a few months, which is fine, which is better than nothing. And so the way I see that is, that's like sharing your finished product. If you're making a piece of furniture, this is a lumber yard, and you get the lumber, you shape it in, and you have a piece of furniture. But we all know when it comes to research, it can take months, it can take years to actually get this thing together, and you can share that, and that's great. So one example of actually sharing your research is here, and basically what I've done is it's a short description of what the research is. There's a link to the paper, which is great, so people can read it. The co-authors are also tagged so that people can actually find these other people as well. And there's also an open access version. It's really important to remember that not everyone has institutional access to papers. So if you have an open access version or a preprint of your paper, it's really handy to post that so that people can read that. Almost every single journal, it's fine in the case of almost every single journal to actually share a postprint of your work, which is the Word version of your final version of your paper, on a personal website. So that's another reason that you should actually get a personal website as well, because every single paper that you do, you can actually do a version of that on your personal website. But most important, on Google Scholar, somehow Google Scholar will find that PDF of your version. So when people actually are searching for your paper on Google Scholar, if they don't have access to the journal, they can access the PDF paper there. if you don't make your papers open access, you are throwing away citations and you're throwing away the opportunity to read your work. So by having a personal website and posting your postprints or your preprints on your website, people can actually, they can much more easily find your work. Not all of us can afford open access fees, or not all of us are at institutions which have open access deals, but all of us have the opportunity to actually share our work online using postprints or preprints. And of course, in this example, I've added a figure from the paper. And if you add a figure from the paper, you can simply just do a screenshot of the abstract of your paper as well. Images are great. Remember, people are flicking through on their phones. They're flicking through Twitter, but if they see text, they'll skip over it. But if they see an image, they're more likely to actually pay attention to your work. Now, I mentioned before that one of the primary ways that people use Twitter is to share the final output of their work. But when you're actually making a piece of furniture, you're making your furniture, but you're leaving a lot of sawdust on the floor. But what people don't realize is that sawdust can actually be quite useful in different situations. There's a huge market for sawdust for a whole bunch of different things. But previously, a lot of people just threw it away. But you can actually sell your sawdust and people can make use of it. And when it comes to making and creating our own work, we have a bunch of sawdust as well, which we can also share. And that stuff is really interesting for Twitter. So for instance, you could record the presentations that you're doing online and post them, which is what I'm planning on doing with this very presentation. And you can do the same thing. Even if you don't have a formal meeting that you're presenting your work to, you can still record something and post it online. It's the work that you're doing, you're putting a lot of time into it. Don't let it go to waste, or don't let it be limited to the audience that you're specifically speaking to. You can also share your research toolkit, because people find this very interesting. So for instance, one thing that I tend to share is if I've come across a very handy R package, if I'm finding it useful, then chances are people that follow me will also find it useful as well. I very seldom sit down and think, what am I going to tweet today? What am I going to tweet? I basically just tweet what I'm experiencing, whether it's a great R package, whether it's a paper. For instance, you might come across an interesting paper, and you can post that. It's important that it's not just about the final product, but that you're actually posting the process of what you're doing. There's a really interesting book, actually. It's right here. This book. It's called Show Your Work. It's a fantastic book, and basically it was written primarily for creatives and artists, but I think it's also applicable to scientists as well, that sharing the process is actually much more interesting, or it gives you much more opportunity to share stuff than the final product. And you can also share useful tips. If you found something very useful, then chances are other people will as well. One thing which people quite often don't think much about is replying to tweets. They think that Twitter is a one-way conversation where you're just there and you're just talking, you're sharing your stuff. And if you're not replying to tweets, that's the equivalent of going out, opening the window to your house or to your building and shouting out your research and closing it and not listening to what other people are saying. Replying to tweets is a really effective way to build relationships there. And if you've got nothing to tweet, then at least you can reply to people, you can ask them questions, you can give them feedback. The incredible thing is it makes people really accessible. A few weeks ago, I got a follow from someone, and I'm like, that name is really familiar. And I had a look, and I realised it was one of my lecturers from undergraduate psychology, all the way back in Sydney from about a decade ago. And I thought to myself, man, like back then, these professors felt so distant. There's no way I could sort of talk to them. But now with Twitter, there's an incredible way, either publicly through reply tweets or through direct messages, that you can actually speak to people. And exactly the same with you. Twitter reduces friction. There's a lot of work to go onto someone's website. You know how hard it is to find an email address for an academic. It's almost impossible. But then with Twitter, it's very easy to actually contact these people because it's just a few different clicks and you're there. So replies are a very good way of actually building your reputation on Twitter. And you don't need to say something, think of something when you're responding to a tweet, because the tweet is there. One thing which is often undervalued is the search function of Twitter. So for instance, if you're very interested in a topic, for instance, that a really good hashtag is rstats, where people are just sharing their tools. It's fantastic, or asking questions. You can search there. And that's a really good way of finding people within your research field. So make sure you use the search function because it works quite well. I mean, of course, it's not as good as Google, but it works quite well to find people who are talking or who are interested in the same topic as you. Another way that I use Twitter is I basically just use it as a way to think out loud. Sometimes I just have a lot of ideas and I'll just post them. Sometimes they're bad. People will tell me that, and that's great. Better I get told I have a bad idea at a tweet than for me to work months and months on a paper, only to realise reviewers are like, that's actually a really bad idea. I would much rather be told that I'm wrong publicly to begin with than and all it takes is a 30-second tweet than months and months of work. It's a great way of actually getting feedback very, very quickly. And finally, you can also use video to share your ideas. They say a picture is 1,000 words, but I think a video is 1,000,000 words because it's very easy to transmit a lot of information. And in this particular example, I've included a hashtag. Like I said before, RStats is a really useful hashtag. I've tagged the author of this amazing package, which is called Hole Punch. I recommend you check it out, just so they're notified, but also just to acknowledge the hard work that they're doing. And also, I've tagged the service which hosts the package as well. A link to a full video because Twitter can only do a 2 minute and 20 length, 2 minute and 20 minutes, 2 minute and 20 second video. We got there in the end. But you can post a little preview of your full length videos there. And I've also added subtitles. It's really important to recognize that a lot of people scroll Twitter with the sound off. I know I do. So if they see a video, they're very, very unlikely to turn the sound on in order to watch the video. But if you add subtitles, it makes it much more likely that people are going to watch your video. Now, a little trick that a lot of people don't know is that YouTube automatically subtitles your videos, and you don't necessarily have to make your video public. You can set up a YouTube account, upload your video as a private video, and if you have a 10-minute video, it'll take about 20 minutes to half an hour for it to automatically subtitle your video. It's about 80% accurate, so you'll need to do a little bit of work. Maybe it's my accent, I don't know. But you have to do a little bit of work to actually tweak and edit it. But it's really, really accurate and much, much quicker than you manually going through and writing the subtitles there. So doing that is an amazing way to actually increase the amount of times people are going to watch and share your video. So use video as much as possible there. So I just want to finish up by emphasizing that social media and podcasts as well can level the playing field for early career researchers. Like I said before, there's the Matthew effect is very clear and present within academia, where the people who already have opportunity continue getting more and more opportunities. With social media, it helps level the playing field so that anyone can get their ideas out there and can get around these traditional gatekeepers. So use social media to your benefit in order for you to build collaborations and to get your work out there. So we're going to have some time for questions, but please, I'm happy to answer questions now. But let's stay connected. I'm on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram as DS Quintana, and the rest of the details are there. And if you're interested in hearing more about issues around being an early career researcher, I'd highly recommend listening to Everything Hurts podcast. So thank you for listening, and let's take some questions now.
Thank you, Dan. That was a great talk. And I really liked how you showed how Twitter can be useful also to make more reproducible research and to make all your materials open. It's also great that it can be a part of the process of getting to your publications. So now for the questions, you can write them down all in the Q&A. I can see that for now we have a question by Pasquale. And it's actually on the name, Twitter names. So can you see the questions there?
No, let me just see if I can find the chat function. No.
We can just read them out.
Yeah. Oh, hang on, I think I found it. Okay, yeah, perhaps read them out.
Okay, so Pasquale says, my username on Twitter has been Nick since the beginning. I tried to change it to something more professional, like an surname, but all combinations were taken. What should I do? Leave my nickname as it is?
Yeah, I think it's fine leaving the nickname. I think the longer you wait to change your name, the more chance it's going to be harder to get the name you actually want. The most important thing is you can actually, your display name you can change. So you can make your display name your real name or your professional name. There are a lot of academics that have that don't necessarily have their full names as their Twitter handle, and I don't think it matters as much. People can still find you if you do it that way. So don't be too concerned if you can't get the name that you don't want, because you can actually adjust your display name that way.
All right. The second question that we have is from someone who remains anonymous, but it's actually a question that I wanted to ask as well, so I think that's great. It asks, what do you consider potential risks for using Twitter for sciences? What do young researchers have to know before they start writing tweets?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a few people that have talked about papers they're peer reviewing and made it very obvious, or it's very clear or very easy for the person to be identified. That's really risky. You don't want to be doing that. You don't want to be punching down to people, and so it's very easy to make those mistakes. I've seen some advice which have said that don't say anything that you wouldn't say in a seminar. I sort of agree with that. It helps keep things professional, but at the same time, Twitter should be fun. So you should keep it light, but at the same time, you should think about that. Always in the back of my mind, I think my boss could read this. So some of the stuff, there's a few gifts I might think, what are you doing posting that? But at the same time, always think in the back of your mind that your boss could be reading that, because they can if it's public. So just be sensible.
I like that answer. I think it's clear. You're right. Maybe you can be a bit more loose than in seminars, but on average, everyone can read it. It's out there for the public.
I've got the Q&A up there as well.
Perfect.
The next question is, would you recommend sharing some of your work results as a teaser to share your thoughts on Twitter, as peer review might take long? On the other hand, journals might have a problem with work already being shared. That's a really good question. Now, most journals have no problems with you sharing your work as a preprint. So in essence, what you can do is you can share a preprint and you can discuss your work in the context of your preprint. And I would highly recommend doing this. So once your preprint is out there, that essentially gives you scoop protection, so to speak. So you can talk about that. You can talk about the approach that you've used, and you can talk about that on Twitter. Now, one thing is a lot of people say, well, I posted my preprint, but no one read it. And that happens. It happens to me. But one thing that you can do is if you want experts to read them, contact them, especially if you've cited them, because you can ask them, hey, have I actually represented your research correctly? Or I have a question about this. Or you might say, here's my preprint. On page 3, I've said this thing. What do you think about that? So you can actually don't be scared to actually reach out to people to get that advice there, or to ask them over Twitter. The worst thing they're going to do is not respond, and it'll be fine. So I would highly recommend sharing your work as a teaser in the context of a preprint, because 99% of journals have no problems with preprints whatsoever. There's another great question from Chris Jackson. You should follow him on Twitter. He's fantastic. Hi, Dan. Have you ever experienced any pushback or outright hostility about your use on social media in science, or your general approach to open science? I wouldn't say outright hostility. I've seen a few people kind of smirk and have a laugh about, oh yeah, there's Dan talking about social media again. He should spend more time in the lab rather than talking about research. You get all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that happens. But I think when it comes to the opportunities that it's given me, I think the proof's in the pudding. I have no qualms spending a bit of time on social media in order to talk about my work. I think it's important to remember as well that the taxpayer is paying for my research, so they have every right to hear about my work, and other researchers should also be hearing about the work there too. So yeah, it happens, and some people are very skeptical about that. I'm not going to pretend that that's not the case. And yeah, I mean, I've also gotten some pushback, or a little bit of pushback, or more questions about my stance or my approach to open science as well. But not direct hostility. But I think it's important to reflect that some people do experience that. But look, it does happen from time to time. Another question from Samantha. I recently started to advertise my qualitative study on Twitter, tag some of my uni lecturers in some organisations. It's been 1 week so far and have 0 participants and need 8. Any tips to make my adverts more effective? So this is, I'm assuming this is a paid advertisement. I get the feeling, because you can actually do paid promotional tweets. I would think that you can actually talk to people. Twitter in general, there are some nasty people and there are some nasty pockets of Twitter, but in general, science Twitter is quite supportive, or it can be quite supportive. So if there are people within your field that have a lot of followers, I would just send them a DM just going, hey, I've got this study that your followers might find interesting, or I'm looking for a few extra participants. Would you mind retweeting? And in many cases, people will do that. People do that for me, and if it's within the sort of scope of the research that I do, I'm happy to do that. But like I said, there are certain things you can do to make single tweets more effective. For instance, by adding videos, by adding images, and by adding careful hashtags as well. But I mean, 1 week isn't that much of a long time. But I wouldn't be afraid to directly target people through direct messages. A lot of people have the direct messages open, or you can just tweet them and just going, hey, I've got a question. Can I send you a direct message? But that's great that you're using Twitter to actually talk about and advertise your work. Great question about bilingual tweeters. Should tweets be in English, or tweets in English and Dutch? English and Dutch, okay. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it depends who your target audience is. If you really want to get your research out there to a Dutch population, then you want to be speaking in Dutch. Some people have 2 separate accounts. That's a lot of work. But other people, depending on the country as well. In many countries, a lot of the population can speak both English and their native, or their official language, so to speak. But in that case, I would probably lean with doing the majority in English, just so you can have the wider audience. But then tweets that are specifically targeted towards a Dutch population, then sure, do them in Dutch. At the same time, the translate function on Twitter is quite good. So, for instance, if you're tweeting something like that and people really want to say, what are they saying? Then you can use the translate function within Twitter to actually figure out what they're saying. So yeah, that's a great question. Okay, another question from Anonymous. Is there a minimum number of followers that you should aim for? Thinking about the Matthew effect within Twitter, the more followers, the more exposure. Yeah, that's a really good question. People, I don't think you should be that fixated on numbers. There are ways that you can sort of behave on Twitter to boost the number of followers that you have. But what you have to remember is, are you actually getting the right followers, or the sort of followers that you want? Think carefully about the reason that you're on Twitter. I'm assuming, because you're listening to this talk, that you want it so you can actually talk a bit more about your work and to build collaborations. Memes are great. I love memes. I love posting memes. But if all you do, and memes get a lot of tweets, they get a lot of attention. But if all you do is post tweets, you might get a lot of followers. But then when it comes to you actually posting about your research, there are crickets. There aren't people actually responding, because the sort of tweets that you're doing is completely different than the sort of research you want to do. If you want to do a Twitter meme account, by all means go for it. But if that's your goal. But think carefully about, I would much rather have 100 really engaged people who care a lot about my work than 1,000 people who like my memes. So think carefully about the sort of relationships you want to get there. And yeah, don't be too fixated about the numbers there. That sort of stuff happens over time. But as long as you're doing those 2 things, educating, entertaining, replying to tweets, then those things will come. Okay, next question. Yeah, this is great. Twitter has developed the alt text functionality to reduce barriers for people with visual impairment. However, I see a very little use of it. Any idea how to foster accessibility for people with visual impairments? Yeah, I think leading by example. This is something that I've seen, but to be honest, I haven't done much myself. I try and add text to my videos, 1, for accessibility, but 2, so that more people can actually see it. So leading by example, and that's something that I can get better at as well, is actually using that. And what that does is that when you post a photo, there's a little box where you can actually describe the text. There's a few researchers that I've seen that are fantastic at this. They before this feature even came up, they'll do a second tweet actually describing the text there. So that's something that you can definitely do as a way of actually increasing accessibility through when you're actually doing that. And emojis are fun, but sometimes they can mess with screen readers as well. in some cases people go really overboard with emojis, but they can mess with those things. But yeah, use those alternative text boxes when you post a video. When you post a photo, you can actually describe the photo there. Okay, hopefully I've got everyone's questions.
Yeah, I think you went through the questions that were already asked. So if anyone still has questions, please keep on posting them in the Q&A. But that gives a bit of time for us to ask some questions. When you're presenting your work on Twitter, of course, you have limited characters to present it in, and you tapped on the threads already. But I was wondering, are there some caveats or pitfalls that people can easily step into when you are presenting your work in a very short, concise Twitter form?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes things can get taken out of context. So if you're doing a thread and maybe tweet number 4 makes sense within the thread, but within itself can be taken out of context. So there's always that can be both a blessing and a curse. I like to write my threads so that each individual tweet can be retweeted in and of itself, but sometimes that's used in a negative way. So it's important to sort of think about how will this tweet look individually, because not many people will understand that it's actually part of a thread. And even though threads give you a lot of space to talk, you still can't quite get the sort of nuance that you would typically get with a blog post. So although your work is much more likely to be seen by more people as a Twitter thread, you don't get that sort of nuance there. So yeah, and most things are well suited for threads, but sometimes you do want to get that you do want to do a blog post to actually better explain your work a little bit more. So yeah, there are some pitfalls there in that regard.
It probably also depends on your work and your results, how concise they are and how balanced you need to address them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Another thing that I wondered about was you talked about if you use an R package that's specifically helpful for you, that you tag the authors. Is it always fine to tag someone on Twitter? Is it always, if you are getting tagged into a tweet by someone you've never heard of, is that completely fine?
Yeah, I think so. Like sometimes people might sort of write a tweet and they'll tag like 20 people. I'm not sure about that. Sometimes that can be annoying because what happens is when someone replies to it, all 20 people are replied to. I like sort of tagging single authors because it's just a way of acknowledging that, hey, this person's done some great work. Maybe my followers would like to follow them as well. You can also tag people within photos too. So sometimes what I'll do is when I'm talking about a study, instead of tagging people within the tweet because I've lost space, I'll tag them in photos. But there is an option, there is a setting where you can choose not to be tagged within photos. So if you want that extra privacy of not being tagged within photos, then you can do that. So yeah, I think generally it's okay. Like, of course, if you're being critical, it's a different story. But if you're talking positively about someone's work, then definitely, like I know if someone found my work, I'd love to be tagged so I can see how people are talking about the sort of stuff that I'm doing. So in that case, if you're speaking positively about someone's work, go ahead and tag them.
And if you're being too critical, it's probably not the best idea to post it on Twitter.
Yeah. I mean, I think healthy debate is good, but keep it civil.
Agreed. Thanks.
I was actually wondering, when you're having this sort of situation where your opinion clash with previous research, or when someone actually comments on your own research, and perhaps the criticism is not that constructive, how would you behave there?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to recognise that there's muting and blocking on Twitter. I'm very fortunate in that I haven't been at the end of this. I've maybe blocked 2 people ever in 10 years, but I know there are people that this happens to all the time, so I'm really, really lucky. But for a lot of people, you can use you can block people or you can mute them. Some people, if they're at a conference and I'm not interested in the conference, I'll just mute them for a time because I don't want to hear about the conference. You can also mute specific keywords. So if people are talking about a certain event or a certain thing or a certain political thing, you can mute specific keywords so you won't actually see them. Yeah, look, critique is going to happen. I've learned a lot I've been one of my I had one paper which was critiqued heavily, but it was great at the time. It hurt, but it was great because it made the paper a lot better. And one of the critiquers actually became a co-author for this paper. I asked him, like, "This is great. You have such great feedback. Would you actually consider being a co-author?" And he became a co-author, which was awesome. But look, that's going to happen, and don't hesitate to use the block or the mute function.
Oh, that's fantastic that you managed to get a co-author in that way.
Yeah.
How is it to find collaborators over Twitter? Do you tend to DM or just look at direct message? Let's not use too much slang. Or do you have other techniques for that?
Yeah, I mean, usually it might start as a public reply, sort of talking about their work, but then when you're actually talking about different, sort of getting more into specifics, then you might do a direct message. So yeah, I've got a number of collaborations from people in completely different research fields who apply the same sort of tools I've been applying. For example, meta-analysis through Twitter, and they'll contact me going, "Hey, I've got this thing. Would you mind contributing?" So. Look, it's a really great way to actually find those collaborations, or you can ask people. You can see that if your interests align, and then you can start chatting publicly. But then once you get to more details, then you can send direct messages. And like I said before, there's much less friction for sending messages over Twitter than there is over email. It's a bit more casual. It's a bit more fun as well. No more formalities. You don't have to get the right greeting and the right sign off. You just get straight to the point, and I love that.
Yeah, that is true. That's actually how we contacted Dan for giving this talk, and he gave quite a quick reply, and we have been in contact through that and worked really nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I see there are no more questions.
I have one to finish off, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because I think what I find hard still is finding the right hashtags to use for your tweet to get the attention that you want. How, as a beginner Twitterer, how do you find the right hashtags, or how do you find the ways or the algorithms that Twitter uses to get you the attention that you need for your tweet?
Yeah, the algorithm is very mysterious. If it was public, it wouldn't work because people would be using it. But use the search function, see what other people are using, follow other people, and see what is working for them. Depending on your topic, hashtags can work really well. Other times they're not as effective. But your best bet is to, over time, build those relationships with other people by replying to them, by asking questions, and then your work can begin to be shared that way. But I mean, some hashtags work really well. I think there's a great like academic chat, PhD chat are really good. A lot of people are asking questions, and I've seen so many questions. They'll ask a question, there's like 30 replies. There's amazing stuff there. The rstats hashtag works really well, but then for other sort of more specific topic areas, they're not as useful. But yeah, don't hesitate to ask specific questions to people on Twitter as well if you have those questions there. But yeah, just search and see what other people are doing, and watch what works for other people, and try and apply it to your own tweeting.
Perfect. To me, that sounds a lot like something that's very familiar to me. Normal social life.
Yeah, exactly.
Talking to people gets you new people that you know.
Just talk to people, yeah.
All right. Well, then, thanks a lot. And for everyone who attended, thank you for your attention. I think we're going to close today's session. And if you want to know more about the riots, please visit our website and subscribe to our mailing list for more info.